porque não estava passando. Ótimo. Melhor. Muito bom dia a todos. Em nome do seminário NCT Entry e Novos e Velhos Saberes, dou as boas-vindas para assistirmos hoje a palestra do professor Kevin Elliott. Para aqueles que não estão bem informados, o seminário NCT Entry e Novos e Velhos Saberes é uma atividade continuada dos programas de pós-graduação do Instituto de Biologia, Microbiologia, Biodiversidade e Evolução, Ecologia, Teoria, Aplicação e Valores e Ecologia Aplicada à Gestão Ambiental. Estamos também aqui em colaboração com o colegiado do curso de Ciências Biológicas e com, obviamente, o Instituto Nacional de Ciência e Tecnologia, Ecologia, o INTT, Estudos Interdisciplinares e Transdisciplinares em Ecologia e Evolução. Hoje teremos, como eu lhes disse, a palestra do professor Kevin Elliott. Eu vou, inicialmente, passar a palavra ao professor Chado, que vai assumir os trabalhos a partir de agora. Então, professor Chado, com a palavra. Então,
bom dia. Bom dia, eu sou o professor Chado Elhani, e a gente tem o prazer hoje de receber o professor Kevin Elliott, que é professor de filosofia da Michigan State University, nos Estados Unidos, onde ele tem vínculos conjuntos com o Lehman Briggs College, com o Departamento de Recursos Pesqueiros de Vida Selvagem e com o Departamento de Filosofia. O professor Kevin é um dos principais especialistas do mundo da discussão sobre ciência e valores e, portanto, é um enorme prazer recebê-lo aqui. Kevin, please, I just introduced you. So.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Charbel. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here and for the invitation. Can you hear me okay? Okay, speak a little louder. All right, anyway, I was just thanking Charbel so much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you today. And what I'd like to do in my talk, as my title suggests, is to discuss three main, actually, is it possible to, just a second, I want to make sure the slides are set up. I think it should be possible to have it just appear like one point at a time, like with animation. Is it set in presentation mode or? Okay, that's just how it works. Okay, that's okay. All right. Well, bear with me. That's okay. All right. Well, so just bear with me. Normally, I would have like individual things appear on the slides, but I'll just talk through it slowly, and so hopefully you don't mind. So, in the first part of the talk, I want to discuss the concept of identifying value-laden judgments in research, especially in environmental research. And so I especially want to talk about three kinds of judgments that I think are especially significant and worth thinking about. And then once I kind of highlight the role of these judgments in science, then it raises the question, well, how do we manage all these value-laden judgments that we need to deal with? So I'll talk about that in the second part of the talk. And then in the third part of the talk, I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk with you about teaching about these value-laden judgments in science, because I know Charbel has, a history of working on science education. I'm hoping that that's something interesting to the rest of you. So this is somewhat a new area that I'm starting to think about. So I'm excited about engaging with you on this topic of how do we teach students about the role of these value-laden judgments in science in ways that are productive. How do we frame this information? So that's where I'm headed. We got three parts to the talk. Let me start with just identifying some of the value-laden judgments that go into environmental science. And this is an area that, philosophers of science are increasingly thinking about. I think it's a really rich area of current philosophy of science. So in this book that I wrote back in, and I guess I can move around, right? And you can hear me okay? So I'll get out of the way of the slides. So in this book that I wrote back in 2017, the key theme that I wanted to highlight was the range of different choices that go into scientific research in general, but I think it's especially relevant to environmental science. So, scientists are having to choose, what research questions should we ask? And I think, as I'll highlight, this can really get interesting. What categories or terminology to use when characterizing the phenomena? How to design studies, best for addressing the issues that they want to address. Developing models, how to optimize them, choosing parameters, choosing the structure, what to focus on in those models. Interpreting ambiguous evidence, I think, is very relevant in a lot of environmental science. And then deciding, how much evidence should we require before we're willing to draw conclusions in various contexts. And then finally, just overall framing the work that the scientists have done. So I was very interested in all these choices that go into scientific practice. And what I want to suggest is that these choices often end up being value-laden. And there's a great paper I recommend by this philosopher, Zena Ward, where she talks about 4 different senses in which these choices can be value-laden. And I think this is really productive to be more precise. So sometimes, somebody might make this choice, like choose a particular study design or choose particular research questions because of their values. They say, because I care about sustainability or such and such, I'm going to choose this research question as opposed to another one, or I'm going to choose this terminology. But other times, it might not be so much their motivating reason, but values might could be used to justify the choices. Or in some indirect way, values could, sort of just cause scientists to make these choices without them consciously recognizing it. And I'm especially interested in actually the 4th sense in which these choices could be value-laden. However they end up being made, the point is, by making these choices one way versus another, they have consequences for society. They, advance certain values like sustainability versus other values like economic growth or so on. And so I'm going to be thinking especially about this 4th sense in which these choices are value-laden. And again, just to be on the same page, when I talk about values here, I'm talking about, psychologists, social scientists would often, talk about values as our beliefs about, what's desirable. Or I would also think about those desirable things themselves. So like public health could be a value, sustainability could be a value, respect for human rights, and so on. Okay, so we've got these choices in science that can be value-laden in the sense that depending on how they're made, they have these consequences. And so I want to just elaborate on this a little bit more and think about 3 kinds of value-laden judgments that I'd like to suggest are fruitful to think about when doing environmental science. So first, I'll talk a bit about research questions, then standards of evidence, and then conceptual categories. So I wanted to start by somebody that I think a lot of philosophers in Brazil are familiar with. So Hugh Lacy has been very involved here in Brazil at the University of Sao Paulo. And he, a key claim he makes is that scientists' research questions are a really important value-laden choice. So this is part of this more general concept he has, that the idea that scientists have research strategies. They have particular sorts of data they typically collect and particular kinds of theories or hypotheses that they're proposing. And as part of this, he says they tend to ask particular kinds of questions. And he wants to point out, he's done a lot of work related to agriculture. And so he points out that there's this tendency to ask questions, especially with big industrial agriculture and the research that supports it, how can we develop crops that have the greatest output? But he points out that that kind of question advances particular sorts of social values. He says it tends to serve the interests of capital and the market. But he says, we could be asking other kinds of research questions. So he wants to highlight the value-laden aspects of these choices. In this International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, they encourage asking, how can we use agriculture to reduce hunger and poverty, to improve rural livelihoods and promote, various forms of development. So this is, both questions are addressing agricultural issues, but they steer research in different ways that serve, different kinds of interests. Lacy would say a lot of small-scale farmers benefit more from, research focused on the second question. Just to, a lot of my work is in environmental health, looking at environmental pollution. And I really see value-laden questions in that area as well, where, a lot of science, when you look at journals of toxicology and so on, will kind of be focusing on, sort of the top bullet point I mentioned there. When we expose, particular model organisms to particular chemicals, does it cause particular health effects? But it's been really interesting to me to see some scientists turning to research questions more focused on environmental justice issues, like the second bullet point, asking, say, do the residents of lower income city neighborhoods experience higher rates of asthma? And can this be traced to higher rates of air pollution in those areas? I especially was kind of inspired to present this question by a scientist in New York City, Luz Claudio, who actually turned to this question because she was engaging with students from some of these lower income neighborhoods. And they said, we really don't think people are paying attention to the issues that we care about. We're really worried about these high asthma rates. And so, it also illustrates how engaging with particular communities dealing with particular problems can steer researchers' research questions in different directions. And then this paper that I have at the bottom is some work where some researchers were trying to bring the concept of intersectionality into their research questions, looking at how different kinds of injustices in society fit together. So they were looking at how Black women in the US have higher rates of uterine fibroids, and they were curious what might be going on with this. And they were wondering if Black women are using more personal care products, hair straighteners, other kinds of beauty products that could be contributing to these higher rates. So again, it's a much sort of richer kind of research question for addressing certain kinds of social issues. So these are my examples of just kind of, I'm hoping that you can be thinking, I'd love to have a conversation about in your research how particular choices of research questions may be value-laden in interesting ways. Okay, so then let me turn to another kind of value-laden judgment that I think is significant to think about. So here I want to build on Heather Douglas's work. She's a philosopher of science who really pushed a lot of this research forward on values intersecting with science. And she says that we would do well to think more when we're having scientific disagreements or disputes or such, to think about, are the different sort of parties to the dispute expecting different standards of evidence before drawing conclusions? So, are some scientists wanting to see more studies before they're willing to say, yeah, I think we've established this phenomenon? Or are some scientists wanting to see different kinds of studies, saying, yeah, the studies that have been done don't provide adequate support. That's not the right kind of study. Or just, what statistical significance levels you want to see in your studies. This tends to be kind of conventionally accepted, that you just kind of know, yeah, to publish in this area, we need this statistical significance level. But Douglas says that's still a choice. That's a judgment saying, yeah, those statistical significance levels are appropriate. So Douglas illustrates this with toxicology studies of the effects of dioxin, in rat studies. And so she points out in some of her work the sort of these choices about standards of evidence before drawing conclusions about the toxicity of dioxin. So she looks at some of these studies where the researchers had to decide, given particular slides, with these, tissues, did the slides provide sufficient evidence that there were malignant tumors or not? And she points out how some of these slides were sort of interpreted different ways in different studies that resulted in different results, because one group of scientists would say, we're not convinced that these slides actually show malignant tumors, and others said, yeah, we think that there's adequate evidence there. And then she pointed out decisions about statistical significance levels. And then, of course, one has to say, well, okay, we're seeing these effects in these rats at high doses. Are we willing to extrapolate and say, yes, we'll see effects in humans at lower doses? And there are all these choices or judgments involved in deciding, whether it's appropriate to draw that conclusion. So that's some of Douglas's work. I want to provide a different example associated with climate change. So I really like this because it's a prominent example. James Hansen is a really influential, climate scientist, climate modeler in the US. And back in 1988, he was asked to speak in front of the US Congress. And he went ahead and said he thought that back at that point, they could see evidence that climate change was already occurring. I mean, they knew based on their models that they expected climate change to be happening in the future, but the question was, could they already see it at that point? And he thought that, he was seeing evidence such that he went ahead and told Congress, I think global warming is already happening. And other climate scientists said, we don't feel so comfortable with this. We don't think that the evidence is really adequate. You see my quotation from Alan Robach there. And Hansen really engaged in reasoning very much like what Douglas would have suggested. He said he kind of considered, well, what are the costs of if I say that global warming's happening and I end up being wrong, versus the costs of just holding back and not saying it's happening and being wrong. And he says he concluded, based on his values, it was better to stop waffling and say, yeah, I think that the greenhouse effect is happening. So it's very much this kind of issue of, how much evidence to demand before making particular kinds of claims about environmental issues to decision makers. All right, so that's my second example of a kind of value-laden judgment that scientists have to deal with. So then let me turn to my third example, and this is decisions about the conceptual categories, how you conceptually characterize your research. And so this is something that I've been talking about a bit. And I have this paper from back about 14 years ago now, where I suggested that choosing categories and terminology and language in environmental science can be significant, because choosing certain categories can increase or decrease people's attention to phenomena. It can alter people's attitudes, so it can create sort of connotations, more positive or negative about particular things. It can end up drawing connections. So a particular conceptual categories can be sort of heuristically fruitful. It can push people in certain directions that are good or maybe not so fruitful. And it can affect how this science gets used in public policy. So I want to provide a couple examples of these judgments around conceptual categories. So an area that I've been interested in is often called endocrine disruption. But my suggestion is that developing this concept of endocrine disruption was actually really sort of significant from a value perspective, because so previously, back in the 1980s, 90s, scientists were noticing these strange effects on wildlife. They were seeing birds with weakened eggshells. They were mating in strange ways and having developmental abnormalities. And they weren't quite sure what was going on. And then the scientists, Theo Colburn and some others, sort of came to this insight that maybe these phenomena could be unified under this concept of endocrine disruption, saying they all seem to involve environmental chemicals, interfering with the hormonal system in some way. Either sort of blocking particular hormones from binding with receptors or mimicking hormones. And so what's interesting is by creating this unifying concept, it created much more interest in this, and then sort of generated more potential to engage in public policy, to potentially regulate these, and so on. But then when you bring this concept to the policy sphere, what I think is really interesting is that there have been big fights over how to define it. So, especially in the European Union, they said, okay, this is worrisome because these endocrine disrupting chemicals can potentially have effects at very low doses because the hormonal system is so sensitive to low levels of hormones. So we need to regulate these. We're going to regulate endocrine disruptors. But then the question is, how do you define these? And so the question was, do we define a chemical as an endocrine disruptor if it just interferes with the hormonal system? Or do we need to show that it's actually having adverse outcomes on the organism in order to classify it as an endocrine disruptor? So it's much easier to show that there's some sort of interference or activity with the hormonal system than to show that you're actually getting adverse effects. So much rests on this definition of an endocrine disrupting chemical. And what I love, I have this picture of a report from the National Academy of Sciences in the US. So it's a really interesting case where the report actually admits that the committee was wrestling with these value-laden issues, where it says that some of the members of the committee didn't want to refer to these chemicals as endocrine disruptors because they felt like that notion of disruption was they actually used the phrase emotionally fraught, and that it kind of prejudged the outcome, that there was actual disruption or effect. And so they went with this kind of bland title, hormonally active agents. They felt like this was more neutral in a sense. These are just active. We're not sure if we should call them disruptors. So really interesting, I think. And then one other example from some more of my work that might resonate with some of the things you're thinking about. I have this paper that came out a few years ago on sort of how we frame conservation issues. So often we use the concept of biodiversity. We're worried about losing biodiversity. We're trying to promote biodiversity. And what I just wanted to suggest in this paper is that biodiversity tends to resonate with particular kinds of value systems. So, when we're talking about biodiversity, we're often, thinking about, okay, there's this diversity out there. And if one thinks that nature has a kind of intrinsic value of itself, well, then, it makes sense that you would want to preserve biodiversity. But for people who value nature more instrumentally for its usefulness for human needs, or in kind of a relational way with one's connections with nature and relationships, it could be that different concepts might resonate better with those value systems. So, if you're coming with an instrumental value system where you're caring about nature because of what it can do for us, well, then talking about, nature's life support systems might be more fruitful, or sustainability, or food security. And if one's thinking about more relational value systems, the ways in which we sort of have relationships with nature that generate value, well, talking about caring for nature or environmental justice or again food security could be significant. So I just again feel like this is an example of how these choices that we might not normally think about. We think, well, of course we're in the business of conserving biodiversity, but one doesn't have to use that necessarily as one's central concept for engaging with the public and policymakers and doing one's science. Okay, so thanks for. Hope I didn't. No problem. We have a nice little interlude here.
I won't concentrate here.
Okay. So that's actually perfect because that was the end of the first third of my talk. So now you get a break. You can just sort of digest for a moment. Think about. I would love to hear your thoughts on ways in which these kinds of judgments might enter into your work, and the ways in which they might have significance socially, and thus be value-laden in the sense I'm talking about. Okay, so then the question is, well, if scientists are making these choices, they're asking particular research questions, they're sort of subtly choosing particular standards of evidence for drawing conclusions, they're choosing particular conceptual systems, as well as these other kinds of choices about designing studies and framing their overall findings and so on. Well, if these have all this social significance, how do we manage these choices responsibly? We might think we want the scientists to just be neutrally doing their work, But if they're making these choices that have all this social significance, how do we handle this? So that's what I want to talk about here. And unfortunately, I don't have all the answers, but maybe we can talk about this. So I had this other book that came out last year, and I pointed out here that this is a really rich area for philosophical discussion right now, trying to decide how do we handle these values responsibly. So some people have said, well, scientists should be influenced by the right values. They should be like thinking ethically about, like Hansen did, about, well, what are the consequences of going ahead and saying that climate change is happening and maybe being wrong versus not doing so and possibly being wrong. And then he should think ethically, well, what's most important? What should my priorities be? And decide what to do. Or you could have more of a political approach. This could be a little tricky, but like trying to get broader public input on how to make these choices. So we were even talking a little bit last night, some of us, over drinks about, sort of ways to sort of engage with groups of the public to, try to inform how science is done. Others have said, well, maybe we need to limit values so that they have like certain influences on science, but not other influences. So like Heather Douglas has really said, yeah, values are appropriate when you're deciding how much evidence to demand. So that's very appropriate, but you shouldn't actually treat values as if they were evidence. So you don't say, I'm just going to accept this claim because it fits with my political values. But you could say, okay, well, what are the costs and benefits of, sort of false positives versus false negatives, and then adjust your standards of evidence appropriately. Other people have said, well, just bring values in when you sort of have like a tie where like two choices are equally good as far as the evidence is concerned, and you just have to make this choice. Well, then maybe you could bring your values in. Other philosophers have said, well, maybe this is why we need a diverse scientific community. Maybe you just sort of, as long as you have enough scientists with different perspectives, they can just sort of argue and hash out these decisions, and you get a kind of objectivity from this kind of interaction among scientists, deciding, okay, what concepts should we use? What research questions should we ask? What evidence should we employ? You might also just say, well, this is part of why we need open, transparent science. So if the scientists are making these value-laden judgments, we at least need them to be as clear as possible about their methodology, their choices, and so on. So this is an area where there's all this discussion. It's not very settled. I just want to give you a sense of these discussions. So I'm going to go ahead and just offer some thoughts. But once again, I'd love to have a conversation with you about this. So I think that thinking about community norms or conventions within scientific disciplines or research areas can be really helpful. So, you often have particular standards in a particular research field for, how it's best to analyze your data, how it's best to report the data. Like I was saying earlier, what statistical significance levels you typically expect in particular journals or research fields, what kind of terminology you use. So I think these conventions are a really helpful starting point for addressing these value-laden judgments, because they help avoid some confusion. You have the sense of, okay, this is how people in this field are typically making these choices. And it helps to make these choices more transparent. Okay, they're probably using a 95% statistical significance level in this area or whatever. And so anyway, I think there's a lot to be said for these kinds of conventions, but I don't think that solves the problem, because I think individual scientists still need to make choices in some cases. So, the typical conventions may not be appropriate in every situation. Say I'm interested in cases where you may have researchers studying environmental pollution in a particular, community, and these community members may say, we're really worried about potentially being harmed by these chemicals. We don't want you to demand such high standards of evidence before you say there may be a problem here. And so, it may not be appropriate. Also, say scientists are working in the legal system. Sometimes in court cases, at least in the US, in civil lawsuits, you're just supposed to show a preponderance of evidence, which is like just beyond 50%, that there, is, say that a chemical caused harm. So it wouldn't be appropriate there to say, well, I'm just using the typical standards of my, scientific field. One has to be sensitive to the context. And we may find that, current conventions, there's a lot of discussion right now about whether to use racial categories in biomedical research. Somebody could say, well, we've always been using these racial categories, but maybe we're starting to recognize there's some ethical concerns about that. And so maybe we need to shift to other kinds of categories. Some have said we should be using categories of ancestry. Others have said we need other kinds of categories. So I think we need to keep thinking, are we satisfied with these current approaches, or might we need to sometimes change them? But I think that even depending on individual scientists and their choices may still be insufficient, because individual scientists have limited perspectives. So they may not recognize, oh, there are ways in which using certain kinds of categories may be stigmatizing of certain groups, or it may be problematic in some contexts. Thank you so much, Juan. That's great. And so then I think we need to consider not just individual scientists saying, what's the most ethical choice here? But we need to be fostering diverse scientific communities. I think this is one of the arguments for bringing people with a range of perspectives into science, whether it be disciplinary perspectives, bringing different disciplines together on teams, having demographic diversity in science, and also geographic diversity, people from different parts of the world who appreciate different aspects of problems, who may ask different research questions. Like I mentioned earlier, recognizing, oh, there are these intersectional issues facing certain groups, so maybe we should be asking different questions. And one of the reasons that it's really cool to learn more about Charbel's work here is that we may need to engage beyond the scientific community if we really want to be more thoughtful about the research questions we're asking, the conceptual categories we're using, the standards of evidence we're demanding, and other research choices. We may need to hear, well, what do other people in society think, besides just scientists? And then finally, it's still going to be complicated when we're making choices. There's still going to be some folks who say, I think you made the wrong choice here, and so I think that we still need to strive for transparency so that those with different values can see how you did your analysis and say, the way you interpreted that ambiguous evidence, that serves certain interests versus others, and I don't agree with how you handled that. And so this is one of the reasons we need sort of thoughtfulness about how scientific information is presented, whether there are ways to sort of express the kinds of values underlying the research done, whether there are ways to sometimes hedge or defer some of these value-laden decisions to others. I could say a lot about this. There are a lot of discussions in the philosophical literature about this, but for the sake of time, I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so you've made it through 2/3 of my talk here. So let me turn to the third part. And again, this is more of sort of new work for me. And I thought this would be a cool audience to get some thoughts about, well, say philosophers are thinking about all this stuff. How can we present this? How can we teach about this to different audiences? Younger students learning about science, high school students, college students, and so on. How do we sort of frame this information about value-laden judgments in science? Just a couple worries that one might raise. So you might say, okay, look, if philosophers of science are talking a lot about these value-laden choices in science, well, then surely we ought to be teaching about it. But my question is, how do we do this in a way that doesn't cause people to have unjustified skepticism? You could picture if you just say, hey, science is full of values and scientists are making all these value-laden choices, people might say, well, should I really listen to what the scientists are saying? What if I don't like their values? I don't know the exact context in Brazil, but in the US, there's already this sense of folks who are more politically conservative saying, yeah, those scientists are just a bunch of crazy liberals. Sure, surely we shouldn't listen to what they're saying about climate change, vaccines, and so on. So it seems like this could just fuel that fire. And it could also become kind of complicated. So that's my sort of challenge. How do we do this well? So just to give an illustration, these data are a little bit old, but this was a survey that the Pew Research Center did of US adults. And so they asked people, they had this sentence with a blank. Research findings in climate change are influenced by what most of the time? And so, about a third of the people said, yeah, the research findings are influenced by the best available evidence most of the time. And then about 23% said the research findings in climate science are influenced by concern for public interest most of the time. But the highest answer, 36%, was that research findings were influenced by scientists' desire to advance their careers most of the time. So the worry is it's really scientists' sort of personal values that people think are playing a pretty significant role in their research. And then 27% said research findings are influenced by scientists' own political leanings most of the time. So again, this is the challenge. If you're saying, if I'm going out there and saying, yeah, scientists are making these value-laden judgments, and people say, well, yeah, that means that they're pretty much influenced by their political leanings. Why should we trust what they have to say? Or this is researchers' desire to help their industry. So anyway, so you get the sense, I just wanted to highlight this worry that, things could go awry if you're saying, yeah, science involves all these value-laden judgments. The other thing is that it has the potential to get kind of complicated. So throughout this talk, the way I've framed it is that scientists are making choices, these judgments, and these choices are value-laden in the sense that depending on how you make them, they have these consequences for our values. But actually, so Heather Douglas is one of the most influential people in the field, and her book is called Science, Policy, and the Value-Free Ideal. So she, rather than talking quite so much about these judgments, she just talks more directly about values. And she says, we've had this value-free ideal, that the ideal is that scientists should avoid bringing values into their work. And she says we need to reject this ideal, that it's appropriate for scientists to bring values into their reasoning. So it's like a slightly different way of framing this discussion than what I've done in the talk. And so it raises the question, would it be better to teach students, is sort of with Douglas's framing, that we need to abandon this value-free ideal? And so let's see, how are we on time? Okay, so if I talk for another 9-10 minutes, is that okay? Okay. So I won't go into this in great detail. We can talk more in the Q&A because this gets a little into subtle debates among philosophers of science working in this area. But in case you're interested, so Douglas says this value-free ideal that she wants to abandon was the idea that non-epistemic values, so social and ethical values, that they should not influence the parts of scientific reasoning that involve reasoning from evidence to conclusions. So she says, we've had this ideal where we keep these values out of scientific reasoning. And she says, well, no, actually scientists sometimes have good reasons to bring these values into their reasoning. And so there are some benefits to this idea, this framing of the literature. It really highlights that scientists have these responsibilities to think about how values might relate to their reasoning. And I think it's kind of catchy. You can say, hey, we've had this ideal, the value-free ideal, we need to abandon it. So you might say, well, maybe we should be teaching students that we had this value-free ideal for science, we need to get rid of it. So is that a good way to frame it? That's the sort of thing I'd like to think about with you. I'm gonna avoid, I don't want to get into the details of this slide. I think it'll take too much time. It gets into stuff, and there's a lot of text here. I was planning to present one line at a time, but the point is, if you want to read more, this is an article by a couple philosophers of science who say that they actually define the value-free ideal in slightly different ways than Douglas does. And I'm just pointing out here that not everybody agrees with her on whether we need to abandon the value-free ideal or exactly how to. Bet says, rather than having the scientists just bring these values into their work, maybe it would be better for the scientists to defer these decisions to policymakers, for the scientists to say, hey, we have to make some decisions here about how to interpret evidence, and you could do it in different ways. We're not going to draw a conclusion because that would be to bring our values in. Let's have a conversation with the policymakers and see how they want to handle it. So don't worry too much about the nitty-gritty there. But the point is just the value-free ideal and whether to accept it or reject it, it gets complicated. Okay. So, in my thinking, I've been trying to reflect on, well, how should we be framing this information about values in science for students? And I think we need to think about, well, what kind of educational context are we thinking about? Are we thinking about really young kids? Are we thinking about university level scientists? Are we thinking about museums and so on? And we also need to think about, well, how confident are we about this philosophical work in values in science? Like, what if people like Douglas and me are wrong in saying that, we have all these value-laden judgments and that we should bring values in? It could be a real mistake to be telling all these students, yeah, science is value-laden. And then, in 15 years, people say, yeah, Eliot was all off base. So we got to think about how well established do our ideas need to be before we start, pushing this into science education. And what benefits could we gain from teaching about this kind of work on the value-ladenness of science? What are the dangers? And so I just want to highlight a few benefits on why I do think we should be thinking about ways to talk about the value-laden issues in science. So one is, if we're teaching about values and their role in science, it could help people to be more thoughtful in assessing scientific information. So it can sort of further the realization that individual studies should be treated with care, because individual scientists they're choosing particular study designs, they're choosing to interpret the evidence in particular ways, particular standards of evidence, and so on. It helps to highlight that we need to think about the funding sources for science, the ideologies behind science, because that really can make a difference in how these choices in science are made. And also appreciating that it's not so shocking if reasonable scientists are disagreeing, because they're having to make all these choices about how to handle ambiguous evidence, what standards of evidence to demand, and so on. So I think this can really help to foster scientific literacy to be talking about this. And also, if people are appreciating all these value-laden choices in science, it's likely to create more public pressure for responsible scientific practices, to encourage open science practices, to encourage more public engagement with science. If we realize that these research questions are value-laden, it supports the idea that, well, maybe the scientists shouldn't be making all these choices themselves. Maybe we should have more co-production and engagement between communities that are going to be affected by science and the scientists doing the work. It may increase pressure that, we need good conflicts of interest policies because of all these value-laden choices that scientists have to make. And it highlights why we need a diverse scientific community, because it's not like any old scientist is going to make the same decisions. Different people will have the appreciation for different kinds of questions and conceptual categories and so on. Okay, so I do think, despite the dangers, there's some real benefits to teaching about this kind of work. So I'll just be very quick here. I think some of our desiderata for deciding how we should frame this, I think we want to be as honest as we can. I do think we want to be cautious not to assume that philosophers' current thinking about science and values has it all correct. And we need to think about benefits and harms in these different educational contexts and so on. So I'm almost to the end here. I really like this argument that Matt Brown, another key figure working on science and values, offers in his book, Science and Moral Imagination. He offers what he calls a contingency argument in favor of what he says is assessing values in scientific reasoning. So sort of thinking about these values. So he starts by saying what I really emphasized in the first part of my talk: scientific inquiry involves a lot of contingent, unforced choices, that you're having to make all these decisions that you may not even recognize about your conceptual categories and your questions and your study design and your interpretation and so on. And he says, especially I think in environmental research, the options we choose have these ethical and social and political implications. And so then he says, when we're making choices that have these ethical, social, and political implications, we should be assessing our values when making these choices. And so his conclusion based on these three premises is, well then, when we're doing science, we should incorporate the assessment of values in response to all these contingent choices we're making. So I think it's kind of a nice argument sort of highlighting this idea that scientists should be assessing values, thinking about values in the course of their work. So I'd like to sort of adapt this and simplify this a little bit and see what you think about this as a way of like framing information for teaching. So I think the first two premises of his argument can be combined to say, hey, science involves a lot of contingent, unforced choices. Scientists are making a lot of decisions, and these choices have ethical, social, and political implications. I think this is pretty uncontroversial, and I think there are a lot of benefits about teaching about this. So I don't know, you can tell me if it's like too complicated, but from a philosophical perspective, it seems like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I think the third premise is a little more complicated. This idea that scientists should be assessing values in the course of their work. So there are some philosophers who say, yeah, the scientists themselves shouldn't get into all that kind of ethical reasoning. And others would say, the individual scientists don't need to be making those choices. We can have like conventions, sort of norms for how these things are done. So I think this gets a little bit complicated. And so my suggestion would be, what if we just said science involves unforced choices that need to be handled responsibly? And so then it kind of leaves open exactly what responsible handling looks like. Do the individual scientists need to be reasoning about the ethics of these choices? Can we have like community norms? Can the scientists try to like defer some of these decisions to others? I don't think this is a super complicated idea. And like I said, it leaves room for discussion about exactly what does it look like to handle these choices responsibly. And so that's why I kind of framed this whole talk. So it's about these value-laden judgments in science, these unforced choices, and thinking about how to recognize them, how to manage them, and how to teach about them. So I've got another slide that I think I'm going to skip for the sake of time and turn to the conclusion. So what I've tried to do is to sort of highlight some of these value-laden choices that I think are really interesting in environmental science. Again, there are others I talk about in my Tapestry of Values book that I think we need sort of a mixed approach for addressing these responsibly. And then we have questions about, well, how do we teach about this, these ideas about values in science? There can be some worries about the effects of doing so. And so I provided a suggestion for how we might frame this work. And I thought, well, maybe we can capture the philosophical literature by highlighting these unforced choices that we need to make responsibly. And maybe it kind of alleviates some of the worries one might have. So I don't know, this may be a little bit weird, but I just have this final slide where these are some of the questions I would love to ask you if we could have a dialogue. I would love to hear your thoughts on, sort of how you see value-laden judgments in your work, and other kinds of value-laden judgments I might not have talked about that much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think we should manage these choices. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we should teach about it. But you get to ask me the questions. You can decide where you want to take the Q&A. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming and listening.
So my point is, we're kind of saying that science is a part of culture, and culture is value-laden. So different culture, different sciences, and so the point I would like to ask is are there universal values? on which science could somehow be
Yes.
rest.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yes.
okay, these are everybody go stats. Everybody's happy with that. And and if they are not, how? If there are not universal values, how could we pursue that?
Yeah. Super great question. So just in case everybody didn't hear, so the question is right on target. So if science is influenced by these values, these value-laden choices, are there kind of universal values? So we often think about science as being this universal endeavor. Again, we were talking about this last night. Does science have this universal character? Or then if it doesn't, what do we do? Do we just have these partial sciences based on different values? So a few thoughts. I think this is a really important issue. So I've been thinking recently, actually just submitted a paper on the idea of the aims of science. And are there like sort of universal aims that then you might say those aims could ground sort of universal values that help to support those aims? So if you said, okay, everybody agrees that the ultimate aim of science is getting truth. Well, then maybe you could have a discussion about, okay, well, what values help us to achieve the truth? And so philosophers will sometimes talk about epistemic values or cognitive values that, are sort of truth conducive. So there's been discussion historically about, say, like empirical adequacy, like sort of you want your theories or your hypotheses to be empirically adequate, to fit with the evidence. Maybe you want them to have explanatory power. So you might say, hey, we've realized over time that if we can offer good explanations, that tends to be truth conducive. Or you could say, actually, a universal aim of science is to provide good explanations. And so, then explanatory power could be a universal value. So I actually suggest in this paper, I'm a little suspicious of the idea that we can come up with some clean, universal aims for all of science. Philosophers have sort of debated about this for a long time, and they really have trouble. You'll have some, say, yes, we want our theories ultimately we're aiming for the truth. Others say, well, no, we're just aiming for empirical adequacy. Others say we're aiming for understanding, and so on. So I think there may be some somewhat broad aims that I do think could, ground some pretty broad values. But then you get into the question of, do particular values help us in our search for truth or not? So Helen Longino is a really influential philosopher of science who famously kind of criticized some of these traditional values. She said, everybody, takes these values like simplicity and fertility and, consistency with, our established theories as being these good cognitive values. And she argued from a feminist perspective that often they could kind of subtly privilege sort of traditional sort of ideas that could be kind of biased. And so she suggested, maybe we need to think of some different kinds of values, like ontological heterogeneity, more sort of pluralism, sort of shaking up the status quo a little bit. So I'm giving a rather roundabout answer to your question, but so maybe just to kind of bring things back around, I do think that there are some somewhat broad aims in science, and I think there might be some sort of wide agreement on certain kinds of cognitive values that can support them. But I really want to be cautious about saying it's all nice and simple and universal. That I think that at the very least, actually building on our conversation last night, maybe there can be this kind of like sort of, I don't know if it's a compromise, but you can have sort of science that's relatively universal, but that incorporates particular sort of local insights or values. So I think that we need to sort of recognize the virtues of both, that we want our science to be relatively sort of broad, but I think we can get ourselves into trouble if we just say, hey, it's just totally straightforward and universal. We need to realize different communities do have relevant different values that may steer our science in different ways. So I wish I had all the answers, but it's a great question for us all to be thinking about, I think. Yeah, this work definitely shakes up and complicates the idea that, yeah, it's super simple, universal. Everybody's going to do the same science based on exactly the same values and criteria.
There is a question over there.
Ah,
No, I'll try to translate. If I do not translate well, please help me out. On the base of the guidelines of climate and biodiversity conventions, is the use of guided values based on the capital, not a utilitarian perspective of conservation or adaptation.
hmm. Yeah, okay, so kind of building on some of Lacey's ideas. So the thought is that some of these major conventions related to like climate and biodiversity, that these guidelines tend to be a little bit more guided by values associated with climate and the market, as opposed to
Yes,
yeah. And is this further, or is this the same? Okay, okay. Yeah. So I might need to sort of let me just sort of the area that I'm the most familiar with involves not so much those big conventions on climate change and biodiversity, but actually some of the guidelines that are used by like regulatory agencies for making decisions about, you know, sort of environmental pollution and so on. And so maybe I can comment on that, and I think it may sort of relate to this. So it's really interesting. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is, you know, this big international organization that helps to like standardize around the world how we make decisions about, you know, say regulating, you know, pollutants, you know, pesticides, things like that. And so they'll create these standards that then like the US EPA, you know, tends to kind of go along with these standards. The European Union with their, you know, Food Safety Authority tends to use these standards. And then lots of other countries around the world will use these standards. So it'll say, you know, say we're trying to figure out if certain chemicals are harmful or not. This is the way to do a good study. So this is the number of animals you should use. This is how long the study should go. This is, you know, and so it provides this guidance for a lot of these, you know, choices that I've been saying are value laden. You know, how do you set up your studies and how do you interpret them? And so I think it's super interesting that just like this questioner, Bruno, thank you for the question, just like the question highlights, that there are these subtle choices involved in how long should your study go. And so some critics have said that actually these study guidelines are, just like the questioner pointed out, sort of skewed toward industry's interests, where if you had the studies go longer, you might be more likely to see toxic effects. Or if you did other things a little bit differently with these studies, this comes up a lot with studies of like genetically modified foods, that some critics will say the way these studies are designed, they're okay, but if you did them a little differently, you might be more likely to see particular sort of impacts. And so I think it's a great point that these value-laden choices aren't just at the level of the individual scientists, but these big guidelines that say how to do science, how to interpret studies, how to do these regulatory studies. They can, in a sense, like institutionally establish particular value-laden choices. And so, assuming I'm kind of interpreting this question in the right way, I think it's a really nice point that I think those of us working on values in science are wanting to think about more. How do these institutional structures, these kinds of expectations for how we do science, how do they serve particular values or others? So thanks for the really good question. Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. It's really a pleasure to see you. I think that the first, my value, pre-value is at minimum very naive position nowadays. I guess you agree with me. So I think that the first step would be, as scientists, individuals, to internalize this discussion and to be clear about which value they are assuming. That it's probably the first point to go. And for me, I think that I'm agreeing with you that teaching is fairly important, at least discussing about it, and open-minded. I see the dangers, as you said, but I'm wondering how to be explicit about it. There is ways to be explicit, because most of the values, they're actually implicit in a paper or in a book or whatever. And for instance, p-values, type 1 error, type 2 error are, I think, really a nice way to teach about values and stuff. And I would like to see your thoughts about it.
Okay, yeah, you make a lot of great points there. And it's really interesting, your last point about the p-values, type 1, type 2 error, because you're right. I think that's a really nice, clear way to see, yes, this is a value-laden choice. You know, it's not like it's not like sort of God from on high said, you know, your statistical significance level should be 95% to do good science. You know, this is a conventional choice that has consequences. And so it's no wonder that Heather Douglas just had this big impact among philosophers recognizing the value-ladenness of science, because that's exactly where she started, this idea of standards of evidence. So I think that's maybe a really nice sort of wedge to like start teaching about it, to highlight that that's a kind of a clear way in which, you know, scientific choices are value-laden. So I love your question about how we can be sort of transparent about these. And it actually, thinking about that, sort of influenced me to write a paper that the title is A Taxonomy of Transparency in Science, because I started thinking about transparency, and I had an initial article where I said, you know, hey, you know, scientists, maybe one way to manage these value-laden choices is to be transparent about values. But then I realized that's really tricky, you know, just like you said, you know, we often aren't recognizing. And so I suggest in this paper, I started thinking more about the complexity of transparency and realized, you know, there's a lot of different kinds of things we could be transparent about. So we could be just transparent in the sense that we're making our papers open access so people don't have to pay to access them. We could be transparent about the data underlying the study, so then other people can go and look at the data. We could be more transparent about our methods, you know, our analysis, so then people can understand, okay, these were the choices that were made. We could be directly transparent about the values. And so you could say, hey, you know, I did my study design this way or my study analysis this way because I was concerned about these consequences or so on. And so often, if we're talking about values in science, there may be this assumption that we have to be transparent about the values themselves. But I want to be cautious about this for precisely the reason you mentioned. We may not recognize our own values. And so maybe if we're more focused on transparency about some of these other things, well, then others can get the information they need to say, hey, you may not have recognized that you were serving these values of capital in the market, but actually you were because of these aspects of your study design. You know, again, we could be, a lot of journals are asking for more transparency about, you know, financial conflicts of interest. So that's another way where somebody may, the scientists themselves may say, well, I'm not really influenced by these values. But if you're transparent about who was funding, other people might say, actually, you know, we'd like to investigate this a little more closely because you might subtly be influenced by these values. So anyway, I say a lot more in there, but it's just to highlight that when we say, okay, we ought to have transparency, this is a really complicated notion. We need to think about what we want transparency about, what kinds of transparency can help us address these issues about values. And I will say, though, there's, you know, interesting work in the social sciences where they're starting to be more likely to have like a statement about one's positionality, you know, about, you know, sort of one's background, you know, where one's coming from and doing the research. So that is a more direct kind of, you know, trying to provide information that might help people understand the values one brings to bear. I feel like most natural scientists would feel kind of strange about doing that, you know, in a, you know, methods part, you know, we did this and, you know, in coming from this cultural context and, you know, having this, but, you know, again, it's something interesting to think about. Yeah. So thank you.
Next question. Traduz aí, Thiago. Tem que botar. Isso.
So the question also, is it possible to imagine a dialogue between science, like climate science or conservation science, and indigenous knowledge?
Well, so if you want a good answer to this, you should ask Charbel instead of me. You know, he's the expert, you know, on these kinds of issues. But yeah, I think it's super interesting to think about. So I don't know about as much about indigenous science, but I think that's one example of sort of a lot of fruitfulness these days in recognizing the value of community engaged research. So, I think that this is one of the cool ways of managing some of these value laden choices where, again, the kind of stuff that I look at with environmental health research, some of the most interesting kinds of questions where, I was mentioning earlier, scientists moving from just asking, okay, is this chemical toxic, to, how are particular chemical exposures associated with particular kinds of disparities, health disparities and so on. Well, a lot of the shift to those kinds of more interesting, relevant questions are coming because environmental health researchers are actually sitting down with communities and saying, okay, what are you worried about? What kinds of questions would be most relevant? And then these communities are sometimes actually involved in like data collection, which then builds the capacity of those communities for being able to take action. They're learning more about the sort of scientific and social issues at play. It's like this sort of back and forth. They have knowledge of their communities that the researchers don't have. The researchers may know things about scientific methodologies that can be beneficial to these communities. And then what I think is super cool is that in terms of like framing the findings in ways that actually get things done, I keep talking to environmental health scientists who say, yeah, we've been studying these chemicals for years. We've been writing these papers. We've been telling the policymakers that there's a problem and we just can't change the regulations. And so back to the first question from this questioner, the regulations are more based on particular standardized study designs that the industry does. And these academic scientists can't get the regulators to pay attention to their studies. Well, anyway, often community members are engaged in political activism. And so if they can collaborate with the scientists, they can then push the policymakers to change things in ways that the scientists themselves really couldn't do. So I think there's so much value in this kind of community engaged research. And again, this is one of the benefits of recognizing that science is value laden, that it involves these value laden choices. This shows why it's valuable for the scientists to actually interact with these communities, because there are these choices that the communities can validly help to influence. So anyway, so that's the kind of context that I'm most familiar with. I think there are probably I'm sure there are some different nuances in working with indigenous communities, because, I was saying in the case of like community-based research, that like these communities could learn from the scientific knowledge of the scientists. Well, I think in indigenous context, they already have particular knowledge systems that, they can really be contributing, and the scientists can be, sort of learning kind of this back and forth interaction. So I think it probably has a lot more interesting nuances, but the idea, maybe again, I can just advertise probably something you already know, but I love some of Charbel and David Ludwig's work on the idea of these partial overlaps between like sort of more traditional scientific knowledge and more indigenous knowledge systems. And so and they talk about how these overlaps can involve both epistemological issues and ontological and value issues. So that's where I think it could be super fascinating. You've got the traditional scientists bringing particular values to the way they're doing their work. Then you've got the indigenous groups with particular values that are intertwined with their knowledge systems. And so I think there's this super interesting question about then, sort of how might you have some interesting interaction between them, where the values associated with the indigenous knowledge systems, maybe it could influence some of these value-laden choices that the more traditional scientists are engaged in. So I think it's a really interesting question to think about.
Juan. Okay. Kevin, I have two questions, okay?
Okay, yeah.
The first one is about the point that you make in the first part of the presentation about the conceptual categories.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
And I think about the diversity of the openness of particular scientific communities to
conceptual diversity. So the question, why this particular scientific community is more conservative about the concepts used by its members?
Yeah.
I think that the answer to this question may be a link to the task of identifying value-laden judgments in the work of the philosopher of science, searching for this kind of question.
Yes.
Okay, this is the first question.
Okay, I'll try to remember that. Yes.
Now the other one is more complicated, I think, because it deals
I thought the first one was complicated enough, but no, go ahead.
it deals with the problem of you as a philosopher of science exploring these value-laden judgments. Okay, but you are searching this in the science that are made it inside the universities, the academic universe, but and we should think about the science that are made in the bellic enterprise, the big tech, these these big companies that co-optate scientists and dominate the actions, the activity. So, what values are directing these activities inside the company? And the problem, the public has the right to know about the values. I think there is a political problem inside these other science.
Yeah. Thank you. I love those questions. Okay, should I? Okay. So let me say a little bit about both. Okay, and let me make sure I can think back to the first one. So that had to do with the conceptual categories and sort of why some communities might be more, sort of open to different categories than others. So actually, I'd like to put this question in sort of conversation with the earlier question about transparency and openness, because so in our efforts to be more open, one of the aspects of the open science movement has been to, have these big databases of data and information. So, especially in the biological sciences, you all may be familiar with work by this philosopher, Sabina Leonelli, who has talked a lot about sort of the use of data in biology and sort of how it's actually done, and how these kinds of big databases play out. Well, what's interesting is in our efforts to be more open, sort of putting our information into these databases, they may actually foster a kind of conservatism, because you have to have a particular ontology for these databases. You need to say, okay, this data falls in this category, this is the kind of information. And so it sort of locks in a particular standardized kind of ontology. And so it really highlights the interesting tensions between different values. On the one hand, we may want an openness to epistemic diversity, but we also, in order to communicate, around the world and make information open, we may actually be closing down this diversity. And so she's got some really interesting work on this. There was a poster at a recent Philosophy of Science Association meeting. I really liked it, where they were highlighting where, say you've got groups in various parts of the world studying endangered species, and they have like kind of non-standard taxonomies that they're sometimes using for categorizing different species. And then you've got these mainstream, sort of like databases of information using a very standardized taxonomy system. And so they're pointing out the real sort of, disadvantages sometimes of having to force all this non-standard information into this standardized taxonomy. It's taking more effort. There are issues of like epistemic justice that communities working with these non-standard taxonomies are forced to kind of, sort of then take their information and put it in the standardized form. We're losing various kinds of, unique information or perspectives. So I guess, so this may not totally answer your question, but I'm sort of riffing on it, the idea that it's a super interesting question, that there are advantages and disadvantages to having this kind of conceptual diversity. And there are big pressures in the way science is currently done that can tend to close things down and, sort of force particular sort of standardized conceptual systems. So I think it's something very fruitful for us to think more about. Anyway, those are some thoughts on that issue. On the second question, I love that you were sort of pushing toward needing to think not just about publicly funded science, but privately funded science. And so this is a case where, so actually I have a course that I teach to advanced undergraduates that's called Values in Science, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I want to acknowledge that it's not all just this happy picture of, yeah, let's bring values into science. The first unit of the course is about like privately funded science, where you might be pretty worried about some of the values entering in. So we focus on like the pharmaceutical industry and all the ways in which they kind of cleverly sort of design their studies to make their products look as good as possible, to try to get them through, to, sort of rhetorically, present information to try to get people to use their products, even if that may not be that much better than a placebo and so on. And so anyway, so by the end of that unit, students are thinking, oh my word, we do not want these private values in science. And then we turn to the second unit, where I talk about publicly funded science and concerns about like the reproducibility crisis in some areas of science, like in biomedical and some areas of psychology, where people have been worried that a lot of published work can't be replicated, partly because of the pressures, publish or perish kind of cultural context, where scientists are just desperately trying to churn results out in order for career advancement. And so anyway, so there, the irony is some pharmaceutical companies complain that they can't replicate so much of the preliminary research coming out of academia. So it's like, okay, we gave the private sector a hard time, then we give the public sector a hard time. And by then, the students might be thinking, we do not want values in science. And so then in the last unit, I say, but actually, it's not clear you can avoid values in science. And so then we talk about some of the ways in which, it's unavoidable, and we ought to be thinking about what values we should be bringing into science. So it's kind of a fun arc to the course. But I mention all that because you might say that, my talk makes it seem like, yeah, values are super relevant for science, no problem. But, maybe certain kinds of values are problematic, that maybe we want to, exclude them, or they go kind of beyond the pale. So maybe, and this gets all the way back to the first question, maybe there are certain kinds of research choices where you're designing your study with a particular result you want to get out of it, that you're the pharmaceutical company and you're just designing your study to make your drug look as good as possible. It seems like we want to be able to say there's something problematic about that. You can't just say, well, those are the local aims of the pharmaceutical company. Their vision of science is to do science to just get their products approved. It seems like maybe we want some more global standards to kind of constrain that. And so I think this, again, is some of the most interesting questions in values in science. Sort of once we acknowledge that these choices are unavoidable, where do we draw the line between sort of this range of legitimate value influences, where we say, yeah, different groups can legitimately bring, they can ask different research questions, they can have different standards of evidence, they can have different conceptual categories, but maybe we want to say that certain choices are just a little bit beyond the pale, where, people will say, look, these petroleum companies would just, there's never enough evidence for them to be willing to acknowledge that climate change is happening. Is that a problem where, their standards of evidence are just so far wacky that, that's just not acceptable? So, yeah, sorry, maybe a little meandering, but hopefully some of that was relevant and interesting.
As we are very multimedia, we have a question in WhatsApp too.
Okay.
So it's a question from Breno Brito, who studied here at Vaz, but now is a professor at another university. And it's the guy I told you, look for you in Michigan.
Okay,
so he said,
cool. I look forward to it.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk, Professor Elliott, and the INCT and the seminars. And then he says, I and he and myself because I have had some discussion what can be one of the strategies about how to manage the use of value-laden decisions and the dialogues about the individual and group responsibilities. It involves the use of decisions about the acceptance of models, theories, data that the scientists make, and how these have to be made in a way that the values used makes sense in your research group and tradition. In this way, we don't need to make one unique list of values and further the necessities of but further the necessities of the formation of the scientist in some tradition and make the values in this tradition more clear, avoiding the myth of value-free idea. And from this, we can make a bridge with the social and virtual epistemology. So, two questions he makes now after this introduction. How much do you think we can advance if this debate on values in science begins to communicate with the recent debates in epistemology about social epistemology and virtual epistemology? And the second question is how we can think about the issues of teaching from the goals of forming scientists, like forming small science. So it's not more about high school teachers, stuff like that. Sometimes we teach science as if we were trying to make the kids become small scientists. And so if you could rethink that, perhaps we can have a more appropriate way to deal with values. So he has an example. We could abandon the idea of teaching to form a proto-scientist or to say to the student that we are in seek of truth, and then present science as having the goal of the human emancipation, the guarantee of a good living. And then or we can talk about the epistemic objective of understanding phenomena in the world. And if you do this, he says, this could give a better perspective to the student about the importance of values.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, lots of good, interesting stuff there. Yeah, I really hope that we can engage in the future. Thank you for that question. So first, I don't know if you can see, but I just put back up the slide where it sounds like sort of the suggestions that the questioner was making for addressing values in science has a lot of resonance with sort of my first thought for managing value-laden judgments. The idea that you can have a scientific community with particular kinds of tradition or approaches to, sort of guiding the kinds of questions that are being asked, the kinds of, sort of standards of evidence that are being expected, the ways of interpreting evidence, the ways of framing the work, and so on. And so I do think that that's really helpful because it's like, this goes back to the classic work of Thomas Kuhn on paradigms. If you don't have any sort of guidance on, sort of how to sort of approach your work, it's like just too overwhelming. And so I think that for the sake of, sort of having structure and good communication and so on, I think that having that kind of research tradition is really valuable. Again, I would just note my caveats that, you can also have research traditions that were developed by a bunch of, white guys from the US that may not be valuable in all parts of the world for asking different kinds of questions that are relevant to different groups. And so, we need to think about, sort of challenging sometimes those community norms, thinking about different ways of asking questions and doing things and so on. Okay, so that was just a first comment. So then the thought was, connecting this up with social epistemology and virtue epistemology. So I wish I had more exciting things to say about that. I don't feel like I'm a real expert with like the current trends in virtue epistemology. In terms of social epistemology, I think there's a ton of resonance with this work in values and science with social epistemology, because all my emphasis on, like community-based participatory research and so on, I'm highlighting the fact that, if we're saying that, science involves more than just following these set rules. I mean, maybe a single individual could follow a set of rules and come to, scientific results. But once you start saying, oh, there are all these choices that go into the science, well, then all of a sudden it becomes really significant that we need to talk about these choices, that one person's choices based on their sort of implicit values, may not be the kinds of choices that, everybody would want to make. And so we need to then hash out, okay, we could challenge these choices. And maybe we need to bring in groups with different values and perspectives to help make these choices. So I think social epistemology is then, incredibly relevant once one acknowledges that science is value-laden. So then turning to the last point about the teaching. There was a paper that I wrote a little bit about where I touched on the concept of critical science literacy. So this is stuff that those of you in science teaching probably know a lot more about. But I was really interested in this work. Susanna Priest is a professor who deals with science communication, and she was really pushing this idea of, we've got this traditional notion of science literacy that tends to, and again, feel free to correct me, those of you who know more about science teaching, but a lot of the notion of science literacy can involve, facts. Okay, do you know this? Do you know that? Do you know such and such? And this idea of critical science literacy is less about facts, but more about like sort of understanding science in its social context. So do you recognize, like Juan was pointing out, that you've got interest groups that are funding science to push their own interests? Do you recognize that, when you're reading the latest research on nutrition and you hear that, coffee is going to make you live an extra 10 years, or, drinking coffee is going to, make you live 10 less years, that individual studies are going to come to different conclusions, and you don't just want to trust a single study. So it involves more of this appreciation for the social epistemology of science. And so I really like the questioner's point that maybe if our science teaching involves more of like, critical science literacy or other concepts, you might like a different concept better, but this more of this idea of how science plays out, and not just, you might say it's just a matter of the scientific method, but I'm wanting to push more toward science in society, sort of the complexities of how science is used, and the fact that, we need to sort of look broadly at differences within the scientific community. So if we're teaching about that, well, then I think this material on values in science ties in so nicely, because it's highlighting the fact that, yeah, different scientists are going to do their studies somewhat differently. Scientists are naturally going to disagree about these things. We need to think about, the ways in which they interpreted the evidence and the kinds of questions they were asking. So, yeah, I think if we sort of, these richer conceptions of science teaching tie in really nicely with this work on values in science.
I'll take a turn now. Well, I try to make commentary on 3 questions in the end.
No, okay.
But before, I'd like to make a commentary on the questions by Professor Hilton, because I think it's very common that we say science is universal, and it's very common that we say other kinds of knowledge. Let's say indigenous knowledge is local, or as Pigliucci said, indigenous knowledge is like subway science. Is comparable not to what scientists do, but with my knowledge of the subway in New York. Well, we have been taught these ideas, but are they correct? Or are they correct most of the time? I would say no. I think the idea that science is universal needs in itself critical thinking and unpacking. Because I think on the one hand, the issue can become very complicated. For instance, part of science is not universal at all. Perhaps the minority of science is universal. For instance, biology is almost never universal. It's a set of general models. If you take a theory in ecology, for instance, it's a set of different models with different domains of application, and they reach generally up to a certain level. And the level of generality, like Kenneth Water explained, is contingentally distributed. Because the living systems, they develop regularity, and they undevelop regularity along evolution. So part of the knowledge that we think that is universal, they are not really. They are general to different levels of generality. But let's complicate things a bit more. A lot of very good scientific studies made to answer local questions. They are not general at all. So someone might be interested in endocrine disruption of fishes in Florida, and could publish this paper and go to a journal, would be recognized as good science. It's entirely local, and it is a scientific truth. And if you look at what we call local knowledge, it is general truth. So, for instance, how fishers explain the concentration of snook in fluorine water generalized across several fishing communities. And they use that general model to predict what kind of fish they will pick at that day, depending on the factors that feed into their model of explanation. So they have a general model too. So I think it's much, we learn this simple thing that science is universal, other knowledge system is local, but things are much more complicated than that, I think. And then I think that as science moves across different cultures, because we don't have any universal culture, but we do science everywhere in the world. So a big question is not turn into Iran science, as we said in yesterday, like Iran has its own science, only in Iran. That's not what you do for sure, because science is first national. But we need to find our identity. So why would be the kind of science we do in Brazil the same that people do in the US or do in France? The Brazilian scientific community is much behind other Latin American communities in asking that. So in Colombia, that's a crucial question. Not in University de Los Andes, because there, if you don't have a PhD in the United States, you don't have a job. But in the public universities in Colombia, all the time people are asking what kind of research we should do for Colombia. We don't have this enough in Brazil. I think it's because we have this idea that it's all universal and we need to connect across the world, but need to do a much more complicated thing, to connect across the world and be local at the same time, and responsive to our own cultural values and responsive to the values that are shared with other scientists around the world. So I think it's much more complicated. But then you have three questions. Values in our work, it's interesting, they are everywhere. I was thinking, and possibly this is true of many engaged scientists, why we make questions about other biologies and how they relate to the academic biology. That's a very value-laden question. Why we say we shouldn't investigate the biology of the community. We should investigate with the communities about their biology. That's very laden in terms of methodology. And then the choice of categories, we do something that institutionally is called ethnobiology, but we hate this term because this term immediately means second-rate biology. So we say we study the other biology about not ethnobotany. But we publish in ethnobiology journal because there are no journals about other biology. So that's a complicated issue. We don't talk about traditional ecological knowledge. The traditional has a role in colonial epigeneticide, so we avoid traditional. We talk about the indigenous and local knowledge. But then we ask, if I'm talking about the knowledge of the Yanomami, I call Yanomami knowledge, because indigenous knowledge is also a bag of different things that you put there together. So you see the categories, the conceptual categories, everywhere we have these. How to manage, I think I have very many doubts. I think only two issues. Value reflection, which appeared in Francisco's talk, is crucial. Because for many scientists, they still live for the free value science idea. And this means that either they are fooling the others because they know exactly what values they have. Let's take that famous paper that we use in our courses. The paper that made Trump come to the press conference during the height of COVID and say, we have a game-changing medicine, which was chloroquine. That paper, the guy says, we have no competing conflicts of interest. Untrue. Completely untrue. So they are fooling people by dividing values. Or for many scientists, are not fooling no one. It's just undeclared language. The values are not really visible. So I think the value reflection is needed, but for this we need to educate scientists differently. Let's talk about the p-value, then connect to teaching. P-values are great to teach about values. Because for most biology students, and perhaps other natural science, it's a technical decision, the p-value decision. But it's completely value-laden, and they don't have a clue about it. So it's good because we can shake in their grounds and say, no, that's not really technical. Claudio in our classes give the class on this. That's not really technical. We need about inductive reasons. It's about asking what worse, rejecting the true hypothesis to accept the false hypothesis. And then it's good because we shake it, and then you put something in the place. Because we cannot shake the students and say, well, now you live with your confusion. So I think there is a lot of things to educate scientists, different, particularly in the natural sciences, for value reflection to become possible. And also about managing, I think we should have been naive about communication. We talked yesterday about framing. Framing is completely rhetorical. So if we ask a scientist, well, should be transparent. The first question is about what? There's so many things to be transparent about, but also transparent to whom?
Yes.
Transparent to whom? One thing is to talk to your colleagues in the community, then you can be transparent about many things. But if we're talking about decision maker, do you really want to be transparent about everything? Or to a politician, do you really want to be transparent? If we do that, you are the most naive person ever, because nobody's transparent about everything. Why on earth you should be? But the natural science thought that, well, you should be transparent, so it has to do with objectivity. That's a very free idea. It's a big problem, because then they can become very naive, go to a meeting with politicians, the politicians have hidden agendas. They're not being transparent, but you are the transparent guy. So you are possibly being manipulated quite easily. And finally, when we talk about value scientific education, it's serious that you are worried about very important issues. This could be detrimental to. And I remember when people start talking about philosophy science in general, there was a paper by Stephen Brush was entitled "Should Philosophy of Science Be Rated X?" And he was worried about this. That's a very important worry. And I think the key point is how to do the didactic transposition, because we need to become these ideas teachable. And to become the ideas teachable, we need to make some simplifications on how to present, think about the language, but we also need to think about the outcome. What's the outcome? So what are we teaching people? And really, if we don't be very attentive about that, we can feel skepticism. And then you brought some nice idea, like look for uncontroversial and simple ideas. That's the right choice. Because first of all, if you look for uncontroversial and simple ideas, it's easier to make the didactic transposition, and the outcomes may become more controllable. But on the other hand, then you introduce the idea of handling responsibly. And I think this needs a lot of unpacking, because then what is it to be responsible? And if you take all the questions about values, like interactions in the markets and in the economy, so what is exactly being a responsible scientist in a situation where commercially oriented science is dominating? So we are responsible as we generate more patents or less patents. so there are a lot of things there that becomes a bit complicated. And then another idea from the literature that can help is the idea of learning progression. Because learning progression, like you begin with simple things, but people progress with scientific education. Some of them, last time they have scientific education in high school. Then we need to ask the question, to the citizen who will never see science again, what's the basic ideas about science and value that they should bring from high school? Because our last chance to teach about this. But then others will progress to the university and they need to learn more. So what's the appropriate learning progression? How we complicate things gradually without losing the basis. So I think that when you talk about this issue, you open a research program on many different issues that appear. And then finally, we're talking about value assessments. Then a question, what do you think about introducing value assessment as part of the judgment of the quality of scientific work? Because we are ranked all the time as scientists, and we are ranked by our social reputation. It's about how many citations you have, and then it's well shown in the scientometric literature. That's much more a measure of how well positioned you are in the network of science than of the quality of your work. But then if you look at quality of work, we think, well, how well reasoned it is, the research question is good, the methodology is good, the conclusions are sound, and these are two very important for quality. But we don't say, well, how well the scientists assess the values intervening in their work. And I think that might be crucial for evaluating if someone is a good scientist or not.
Right. Yeah. Super interesting. And so yeah, I can't resist, sort of, sharing some of my thoughts on that. Do we have until noon? So I have a few more minutes to respond, right? Okay, cool. I just want to make sure we've got time. So yes, lots of really interesting things there. So one is on your point about local versus universal science or knowledge, I think it's really helpful to, I think one can make this distinction. I'd like to sort of suggest it. So one sense in which science might be local is in the sense of like the context in which it applies. So like you might say, okay, this scientific information applies in sort of this area of Brazil, but ecological conditions are somewhat different somewhere else, and so these same things aren't going to apply. Or you were noting biological organisms may have developed, so in this particular context with these organisms, this applies, but not in other contexts. Another sense in which science could be local, though, would be that certain groups of people in a certain culture accept certain claims, but then other people in another culture don't accept those claims. And that, I think, is a more stressful kind of local knowledge. And so you might say, look, we don't want that. We want everybody in the world to agree about what applies to these Brazilian fish. But it might be a little more complicated than that. There's actually, I've been talking with this science policy figure who highlights the fact that, say you're dealing with issues in environmental pollution, there may be legitimate disagreements about how to interpret ambiguous evidence. And so it may be appropriate to have pluralism, at least for the time being, to say, yes, there's this view about, sort of the nature of this pollution. There's this view, these other scientists have this view. And so at least in the medium term, maybe we need to acknowledge local science, even in the sense of what we're accepting, our views. So I think it's really interesting to think about that. Yes, okay. And so then turning to the issue of the value-free ideal and these scientists who might still be tempted to, I can go all the way back to the very beginning of the presentation. This is part of why I really like Zena Ward's paper, because I think there's this temptation to maintain the value-free ideal by saying, hey, we're not bringing values in as like motivating reasons. We're actually trying to be very rigidly non-value influenced by, we are totally trying to keep values out of our work. But you may still be making choices that have value-laden consequences. So even if you are trying to be the most value-neutral, value-free scientist in the world, you're like rigidly keeping values out, you're still choosing a particular p-value that is going to have particular social consequences. So this is why I really like this sense of recognizing different senses of value-ladenness. It helps to break down this idea that we can maintain the value-free ideal. I just don't think you can maintain the value-free ideal in this fourth sense. When you ask particular questions, when you interpret ambiguous evidence in particular ways, when you choose particular standards of evidence, when you choose particular conceptual categories, these just unavoidably have particular social consequences. So I think that's a helpful distinction for understanding even the debate, why some scientists are saying, no, we're trying to maintain the value-free ideal here and it's good, versus others saying, look, that's just a lost cause. I love your point about the transparency to whom, because that's actually, I mentioned when my taxonomy of transparency paper, one category of sort of complexity of transparency I had was the content of what's being disclosed. Well, another category was to whom. Are you being transparent in ways that are meaningful to the other scientists? Are you being transparent in ways that are meaningful to particular communities or to policymakers or so on? And so you highlight that you might not want to be totally transparent to some of these groups, but say you do want to be transparent, the ways to be meaningfully transparent to other scientists may not be the ways to be meaningfully transparent to other groups. So like just, putting all this data in some database may be great for other scientists in your field, but the average person on the street, this is of no use to them. And so again, I think this is why community engaged research can be useful, because sometimes like there are really cool examples of creating databases of information in ways that are a little more meaningful to normal people. Like I like to give this example in Oakland, California, kind of near San Francisco. They've got a lot of environmental pollution, and this community group has worked with scientists to put up air quality data on the web, so you can like search and kind of find out what the air quality is like in your area, and you can then report air quality data. So it's like this kind of citizen science initiative. So that's a kind of transparency that's more relevant so that you know, whereas the scientists themselves might not have, you know, been as likely to create something like that. And there are other sort of nuances to transparency too. Like, what's the timeline? Are you being transparent right at the start of your research, providing all this information, or later on? So, you know, back to this idea of naivete, maybe the time to be transparent about all this isn't when you're sitting down in the meeting with the politicians, but there may be other contexts in which you can do that. So I love that point. I think your idea about the, yes, your point about the didactic kind of transposition and my word responsible, yes, as I was creating the slides, I thought, yes, responsible is a really loaded term. And I'm curious, though, if it's a way to acknowledge that this is really messy. Like, in some ways, I thought, well, yeah, you actually have to acknowledge that different people can disagree about what's responsible. So I thought maybe that's like a simple way of, maybe as one's presenting this, recognizing, yes, we want to address this responsibly, but different groups are going to have different conceptions of what responsible is. So maybe that's about as much as we can say. It's responsible, but we're going to have fights over responsibility. And that also ties in with your point about, you know, could we assess scientists in terms of like like we're assessing the quality of science, we're assessing the value, you know, acceptability. So on the one hand, you know, the worry is just like with responsibility, folks are going to have different conceptions of, you know, what is responsible science from a value-oriented perspective. I will mention there's a philosopher named Drew Schroeder who's been writing about the idea of democratic values, not in the sense of like, you know, the value of democracy, but he wonders, like, say we're dealing with environmental pollution, or say we're dealing with climate change or biodiversity preservation. And we're wondering, well, sort of how should we handle some of these decisions where, like, you know, we could place more emphasis on sustainability, or we could place more evidence or more emphasis on economic development, and we're trying to figure out how to weigh these values. Well, he says, you know, could we find ways to try to assess the values in our society? Like, how do people on average in our society want to weigh these priorities? And so he says, you know, you could do, you know, you can work with social scientists to do some surveys, to do some analysis and say, okay, how do people want to handle these trade-offs? And then if you came up with, in a particular research area, you told the scientists, okay, this is the democratic value of how to sort of handle these trade-offs. This is what you should do. Well, then maybe you could assess it. But as I've written, I mentioned in my latest Values in Science book, I think that trying to assess the democratic values is going to be really complicated. You're going to have such disagreements, you know, within society. You know, even if you try to average it, you're going to have vast different approaches. I'm not totally clear whether you can, and then trying to get it specific enough to particular areas of research. I feel like it's an interesting proposal, but really difficult to put into practice. So, yeah, please jump in. Yeah.
What I was trying to say, it's not exactly assess the values that the scientists are assuming, but assess if there was value assessment, and trying to come with some kind of metrics about the quality of the value assessment. So it could be any value, but there was reflection, and this was really
I love that.
not a high standard reflection, like they should have philosophical reflection about values, but some standard for, well, it's not just playing the game, not because we asked it and then the guy wrote anything there. There are quality there, minimal standard quality, and then say, well, there was spots about values.
Oh, I love that. And actually, so this relates to, I submitted a little grant proposal over the past year and it wasn't funded, but actually to try to come up with a way to help scientists do that a little bit, I said it would be really cool to develop like a tool to help scientists be more reflexive in their research, to like sort of have a set of different kinds of questions they could ask about, you know, to help them think through doing exactly what you're suggesting. Like, you know, okay, you know, why am I asking this question? Are there other questions that we could be asking? just sort of getting them to think a little bit about the standards of evidence they're demanding, or how are they framing their work. So wondering if you could set something up like this. And Matthew Brown, in his book, Science and the Moral Imagination, he's got this really simple idea of creating like a quadrant where you, like on a piece of paper, you think about, okay, who are the stakeholders for our research? You know, what are the kinds of values we're bringing to this? What are the potential outcomes that we would like to bring about, and so on. So that's like a very simple tool. I'd love to develop something a little bit more extensive, but yes, so if you could like help the scientists to have a way of thinking this through, and then actually have the scientists show, yes, we actually did a little bit of thinking about this, that is a really cool idea. Yeah.
I think it's time for us.
Yeah, totally.
So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Really enjoyed engaging with you.
Thank you very much. Vou fechar aqui.